Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and today's episode is called Jason Rezzo Georgiani versus Bernardo Kastrup because these two men have been doing battle in my mind ever since I started doing my series on Prometheus and Atlas. If you follow this show, you'll know that both men have had a profound influence on my thinking. And if you watch some older episodes, before the channel started growing, you'll notice that I was very much a Schopenhauerian. You might even say I was a Castrupian in so many ways, especially if you follow me on Twitter. But I like analytic idealism, but not as much as I used to, and it's not my metaphysics uh, that I use anymore. And this episode is kind of explaining why. I have to start out by saying that um this is not a peer review of Bernardo Kastrup's work. I am not his peer. This man has a PhD in philosophy. He has a PhD in, I believe, computer engineering. You know, fresh out of college, he's working at CERN. I mean, this guy's a genius. And I have a lot of affinity towards him because he, like me, has an Ibero-American background. And he, like me, grew up in a Germanic culture. He was born in Brazil, but he's a Dutchman. I was born in Puerto Rico, and I'm an American. And so I don't know. I see a connection there, and I don't know. I think it's cool. I like the guy. Um, but I also like Dr. Jorjani. I like Jason Jorjani's philosophy, and in my work on Prometheus and Atlas on this channel, I've changed my metaphysical views a lot. And this is what this show is about. So let's get into it. So first of all, I have to say that Bernardo Kastrup, even if you don't hold to analytic idealism, uh, he is the master at demolishing physicalism. He is the master of demolishing materialism. And there are more than one interview on YouTube that you can find where it starts as a debate between him and a physicalist, him and a materialist, and it ends as the materialist just asking questions, trying to understand what Bernardo is saying. Like they're not even defending physicalism anymore. They're just trying to like learn from him. And it's funny because they always start off by as soon as he starts to catch them, they start off, well, I'm not really a physicalist, I'm not really a materialist, or they redefine what matter is. And that's because his takedown of physicalism is definitive in my view. I don't think you can look at the latest discoveries, whether it be quantum mechanics or foundations of neuroscience, and still be a physicalist for any other reason than you want to be. That's what people do. So you have to always give Bernardo Castro for that. And if you're going to read him for nothing else, read him for that because, in my view, he's demolished physicalism, and he's probably done more than anyone to do that online, at least. Um, he in one of his video series, you'll see that he leans a lot on the scientific work of Donald Hoffman and Carl Friston. You can pause this and read this for yourself. These are selections from the book Active Inference. Basically, Carl Friston's theory, and this is all neuroscience. This isn't philosophy. If you look at the upper left-hand corner, you'll have my artistic depiction of active inference and the free energy principle. Free energy in Friston's model is surprise. It's the disconnect between expectation and reality. And so what you see in the upper left-hand corner is you have an environment represented by the dots in blue, and then you have organisms. The internal states of the organisms are represented by the red dots, and the external states, i.e., the environment, is represented by the blue dots. The yellow dots represent what's called a Markov blanket. Now, the Markov blanket is a mathematical abstraction that simply symbolizes that which separates internal states from external states. So the Markov blanket also has two aspects to it. It has a passive aspect and an active aspect. And so these organisms, the internal states of the organisms, have absolutely no direct contact with the external states of the environment. All they have to go on are the external states impingements on the Markov blanket. And in doing this, they are able to create a subjective model of reality that allows them to predict future impingements. And the more accurate those predictions are, right, the better the model is. Or in other words, the better the model is, the more accurate those projections are. Um, and so in the case of the human being, um, our internal states are represented by our brain. The body is what you might call our Markov blanket. It has passive states, i.e., our five senses, and it has active states, i.e., our muscles and nerves and bones and all that. And then the external states are simply the environment in which we live. And you'll notice that the human brain lives in a bone box, this warm, wet bone box that's pitch black on the inside. And the brain has no direct access to anything that's happening outside the bone box. But what the brain does have is it receives electrical impulses, right, from our from the nerves of our eyes, nerves of our ears, the nerves of our skin, the nerves of our tongue, the nerves of our nose. And it receives these electrical impulses and then shoots out its own electrical impulses to the rest of the body in return. Now, the brain's, the internal state's chief goal, according to Friston, is to maintain homeostasis, right? It does not want things to change. It wants things to stay the way they are, nice and comfy. And so it can go about this two different ways. It can take the electrical impulses as they come and react, or it can predict, let's say this is my oversimplification and it's just it's not exactly what's in the book, it's just the layman's oversimplification. Let's say the brain just wants to predict effectively the next 100 rounds of electrical impulses based on the electrical impulses it has received in the past and is receiving now. In order to do that, it would create a model, right? It would create a model that would allow it to predict accurately what those are going to be. And that's all it is. So that's what's happening with the brain. And so this model of the world, this subjective model of the world, the subjective universe that the brain creates for itself, is that model that allows it to act in accordance with what it guesses will be future electrical impulses that will determine the electrical impulses it shoots out in return in order to maintain homeostasis. Now, this is a much more efficient way of governing its affairs than just passively, reacting to new stimulus as it comes along. Um, Creating a model of reality or each round of electrical impulses is too much. It's better just to have one that it only has to tweak slightly if it's wrong. So you would imagine, for example, if somebody that's walking down the street, they see a snake, they get scared. Oh no, it's not a snake, it's just a rope, right? The brain predicted incorrectly that what they were next to is a snake, but it got everything else right. So it only has to change that one little image from snake to rope, what it really is. It doesn't have to change everything else. Same thing if you've ever had the experience of thinking someone was in your room, but really was just like old clothes hanging on a chair or something. That's what the brain is doing. So this is essentially active inference, right? And again, the better the model, the less the surprise, the less edits it has to make. and we're not the only ones to do this, according to Friston, right? Um, you know, bacteria or single-celled organisms also have internal states and external states that are separated by a Markov blanket, and they too have to create a subjective model of reality that allow them to um, infer what's going to come next and act accordingly. Um, a perfect example of this, and it's one that Bernardo Kastrup uses, is uh, an airplane, right? So the plane itself is a Markov blanket, right? It has passive states, i.e., its sensors, and it has active states, its engines, its flaps, and ailerons. And then the internal states are represented by the pilots in the cockpit, right? Now imagine if this plane was flying through a tropical storm and the pilots can't see outside. It's just pitch black. It's nothing but, fog and water. How do the pilots fly the plane? Well, they use instruments, right? Now, those instruments are symbols, right? Those different dials and different little gadgets are symbols which represent and correspond to the external states outside the plane, right? The world outside the plane is not what the instruments show, it's what the instruments represent, right? And that representation is enough for the that symbolic representation, symbol is the key here, is enough to oversimplify the situation they find themselves in and allow them to act accordingly in their maintaining of homeostasis, right? Um, and so the pilots don't actually have to know a damn thing about what's actually happening outside. They only have to know what the instruments are saying in order to pilot effectively, right? And so the basically what we come to the conclusion is based on Friston is that our subjective experience of the world, be it space, time, matter, energy, color, smell, all that good stuff, is nothing but a useful fiction. It's dashboard on the dial of this plane, right? They're symbols that represent and correspond to an objective reality outside of us, but they are not the objective reality. And again, Donald Hoffman's work with the free, what is it, fitness beats truth theorem, also ends in that conclusion, right? Natural selection does not select for veridical perceptions of reality. Okay, our senses don't exist to tell us what the truth is. Our senses exist to guide us in doing four things successfully. We need to fight, we need to flee, we need to fornicate, and we need to feed, right? We got to feed ourselves, we got to reproduce our species, and we need to fight and flee accordingly in order to survive. And our five senses basically do that by not telling us what the world is really like, but by guiding us, pointing us to what we need to do, what is worth fornicating with, what is worth eating, and what should be fled from, and what should be fought for. Um, and so basically, Friston's work and Hoffman's work combine to show that, again, as I've said on Twitter and as I've said on this channel, it appears that science has caught up to Kant, that there is a distinction between noumenon and phenomenon. There's a distinction between the world as it actually is and the world that is as it is perceived. And, this takes us to Schopenhauer. So, Bernardo Kastrup stands on the shoulders of giants. He acknowledges this, and he makes a similar move that Schopenhauer does, right? If space, time, matter, and energy are useful fictions that are generated by the mind in order to ensure survival, if in other words, they're simply mental phenomena. Okay, that doesn't mean that the spoon isn't real. The spoon is definitely real, according, referencing the Matrix. What it means is that the spoon is a mental phenomenon. The spoon is a symbol, mentally generated symbol corresponding to a very objective reality outside of us, but it is not that reality. So if space and time are constructs of the mind, then that means whatever exists outside of space and time can only be one. It has to be unitary because you need space to have multiplicity, right? And you need time sequence in order to have multiplicity. But if whatever is real, right, the noumenal reality, objective reality, exists outside space and time, then it can only be one. Now, Schopenhauer, basically, as I've said before, continues where Kant left off. And he says that, well, you can know the nomenon. Kant is wrong. You can know what the nomenon is, right? Because if your body is itself a representation, if it is itself a phenomenon, then by looking inward, you can see that behind this representation called the body, there's a will to live. Um, but what Schopenhauer said was that if that's the case, then all of nature as representation is representation of will, and there can only be one because it exists outside space and time. And it is what, in a sense, through our representation, generates space and time as a symbol. And Kastrup follows this, but again, what he does is he uses science and research that wasn't available in Schopenhauer's time. Kastrup is a naturalist. He is a naturalist, okay? And so he looks to nature to find answers, right? And so basically, if you study, you can find this paper online. I'll put a link in the description. If you study the dreams of people with dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be called multiple personality disorder, these people in waking life, they have one body, but the mind has fragmented because of trauma, abuse into multiple personalities, right? And these different alters will take turns having executive control over the body. So if I was a DID patient, maybe I would speak to you like I'm speaking now, but then later my demeanor would change, my voice would change, and I would be talking to you as a completely different person with different values and even a knowledge base, perhaps. Um, and what happens with these people in DID, a lot of them, when they have dreams, the different alters appear as characters in the dream. And what's interesting about that is that after the dream is over and everyone's awake, and the different alters take turn talking to the psychologist about their dreams. Um, they all talk about the same dream, but from the perspective of their own character. So if you would imagine that, let's say I have a dream that, let's say I have DID and I have three personalities, right? And I'm sleeping and I'm dreaming that I'm in the middle of a UFC fight, right? So one of my alters is a fighter A, and one of my alters is fighter B, and the other alter is the referee, and the fight goes down. A beats up B, submits him, and then everyone wakes up. And then they talk about the dream, and A says, "Yeah, I took him down, I punched him, and then I choked him out." And then B, when he has executive control of the body, says, "Yeah, I had a dream. He took me down, he punched me, then he choked me out." And then C, when he has executive control of the body, will say, "Yeah, I saw A take down B, beat him up, choke him out, and then I pulled him off and I raised his hand in victory," right? And so Kastrup uses this as an example in nature, um, that can explain what's happening, in the macro, right? An example of the micro that it might be what's happening in the macro. And so for Kastrup, all of reality as we know it is simply the dream of a mind at large, an ultimate mind, um, that has something akin to dissociative identity disorder, and it's dreaming this reality, right? And we are the alters, right? So that's analytic idealism in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it. I recommend you read Kastrup, and I will have links to some of his cooler videos where he describes the whole system in detail. And look, Kastrup has said many times that analytic idealism is not, the last say on metaphysics, right? It's not the final answer on metaphysics. He did not beat the game, right? Um, what he says is that this is the best model available today. And he basically has five criterion, right? It has explanatory power. Yes, it does, right? Um, it has conceptual parsimony. Oh, yes, it does. There's only one thing that exists. It's the one mind, right? And you can explain everything from that one mind, right? And you can explain phenomenal existence, um, and you don't need to explain consciousness because it simply is. But you can explain matter from this model, right? You can. The materialist, the physicalist cannot explain consciousness from matter, but this model can explain matter from consciousness, and it's the same type of thing that's happening when matter exists in your dreams. If you've ever had a dream of getting hit by a rock or throwing a rock or driving a car or jumping off a building or eating something or making love, whatever, and you felt the wind and you felt the other person and you felt and heard and all that stuff. I mean, essentially what Kastrup is saying is that uh our subjective experience of reality is akin to a dream, right? And we're simply the alters. And so it's the same type of thing. Empirical adequacy, right? Um, this doesn't contradict anything in science. It just doesn't. If anyone thinks it does, is because they're presupposing that materialism is the default scientific view when it's really a philosophical view. It's we've talked about in Prometheus and Atlas. It's a metaphysical stance. Science is a process. Science is a discipline. It's something you do, not something you believe. And just because for historical reasons, modern scientists for the most part have been materialists, that doesn't mean that materialism is the scientific position. It's simply a position those people took that isn't necessary. Internal consistency. Yeah, this model has internal consistency and it's overall coherent. If these are the five rules of the game, then Bernardo Kastrup definitely wins, right? If you are into metaphysics, if you're into ontology, and these are the five rules of the game, the five things you need from metaphysical schema, this is it. Kastrup wins. Game over for now. But now I'm going to explain kind of like why I don't hold to analytic idealism anymore. Or maybe I do, but I'm just in a modified way. Who knows? I'll let you decide. There's my little image of Friedrich Nietzsche beating up Schopenhauer. First of all, let's talk about scientific theories, right? Um, I think, when you look at Friston, when you look at Hoffman, what they have provided us are scientific models. And scientific models, as we've learned in Prometheus and Atlas, are themselves tools, right? Um, Different scientific models are like different kinds of tools. They do different things and show us different aspects of, they paint different pictures, right? So if you look at this picture, I have a microscope, I have a telescope, I have LiDAR, I have X-ray, I have infrared, I have sonar, and then I have the naked eye represented by these different images, right? And I would say that you know, Hoffman and Friston's theories are true to the extent that they allow us to predict the future accurately. But I think I, in the past, have made a mistake in saying that science has caught up to Kant, right? Like science has vindicated phenomenon and representation, right? Um, and that now, we just need to move out of the way and go forward. I don't think that's true. It's possible that in the future, someone will come up with better theories than Hoffman or Friston's, and that these theories are better, not because they reflect some objective reality, but because they allow us to make better predictions about how the brain works and how perception happens. And both these men are scientists. Like Hoffman himself has said, if he can't recreate all the different laws of physics that we know based on his theory, then it's just wrong, right? Because he has a theory of conscious agents, um, which we'll get in, we'll touch on a little bit later. But he says, if I can't recreate derive all the different formulas of quantum mechanics and special relativity and general relativity and all that stuff from my model, then it's simply wrong. So, he has a great head on his shoulders, right? We're not talking about like faith or dogma. We're talking about science and data. So, like I said, I think if you make the mistake I made in the past by saying, again, science is caught up to Kant, it has, but again, it can still be superseded, right? Someone can make a better telescope, a better camera that shows us some other aspect of nature, vis-a-vis the brain and how perception works, that could cause us to discard Friston, discard Hoffman. Uh, so that's the first part. I think we can't take, we need to be instrumentalists when it comes to our scientific theories, and that includes the ones that seem to vindicate Kant, right? And I'm not saying Bernardo doesn't do this. I'm saying I did not do this in the past. The other thing, but the big criticism I have, the biggest beef I have, is an ethical one. So, ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, meaning character, moral nature, custom of a people, right? Of an individual or people. And I think when it comes to analytic idealism, the following passage is the big Achilles heel and the part that turns me off the most, right? The takedown of physicalism does not turn me off. The arguments for idealism do not turn me off. I think they're solid. I think, but this is the part that bothers me. And you can read this on your own, but it's essentially a denial of free will. um, Kastrup is saying, if it is true, let's say that there's only one mind, that's the only thing that exists, and basically we're all its alters, not just you and me, but like chimpanzees and insects and bugs, we're, and or, spiders and fish, we're all the alters of this one mind, and that our subjective experience of the world is simply that. It's a symbolic representation which corresponds to the internal states of that one mind, and in its existence as alters and emotional states. Then I mean, there's no free will, right? There's no Pedro. There is no you that can truly be an ego, right? A self-existent ego, independent, and free to choose. Um, Kastrup talks about how, once you internalize analytic idealism, then you realize that you're all we are is the eyes of the one mind looking inward toward itself, right? And that it wants to, you might say that it wants to know about itself, perhaps, or is knowing about itself, especially in the form of man, where it can metacognize. Um, and, that your task is to simply observe, right? You don't need to win the games of life, right? You don't need to, you know, have control of anything. Ultimately, you're just here to observe, and that when you die, what that is that you're the altar which you are. It basically, disentangles the way, let's say, a whirlpool would in a river, and the contents of that whirlpool stay in the river, right? And so your experiences and your memories and everything you've learned and felt, stays a part of the one mind, right? Um, and affects it somehow in its continual evolution, and that's why you're here, right? And so you don't have to, like I said, win the games of life. You simply have to play them and observe them, or at minimum observe them. Again, I'm sorry, no. Here's a great um, selection from Thanosis, Georgiani's work, where he shows how the this is his takedown. One probably part of his takedown of Castro's metaphysics, but this passage in Metapolemos is, I think, makes a strong argument. It says, freedom is the foundation of any meaningful ethical system, right? Without free will, without the very concept of ethical responsibility, uh, becomes incoherent. Both scientific determinism and religious fatalism are reductionist worldviews that deny the possibility of genuine ethical agency. And you know, uh, Bernardo Kastrup admits that he himself is a reductionist. He wants to reduce everything to one, right? Continuing, scientific materialism with its deterministic framework reduces human beings to mere mechanical entities governed by causal laws. Similarly, religious fatalism, particularly in the monotheistic traditions, posits an omniscient and omnipotent deity that predetermines all events, rendering human actions meaningless within an ethical context. Now, to be fair, you know, Kastrup is not, his ontology isn't inherently religious, um, though it converges with the religious, and he doesn't believe in, as far as I can tell, like a big bearded man in the sky sitting on a chair, as but um, the weakness I see in analytic idealism is not rational. It's not a logical weakness. It's an ethical one, right? Um, it's better than physicalism in that it makes room for psi. It's better than physicalism for all of these reasons right here on your screen. For these reasons, it is much better than materialism and physicalism. And if someone were to tell me that they are burning their Daniel Dennett books and buying a library of Bernardo Castro books, I would applaud them, and tell them they're on the right path. This is a much needed improvement. However, unlike, not unlike these physicalist metaphysicians, Kastrup's system makes free will meaningless. And I think if free will is meaningless, then every human endeavor is meaningless. Art is meaningless. Um, there is no true creativity. There is no true future for us to strive for. There is no true agency, and I think it really, for me at least, um, to really grok analytic idealism would require me simply becoming apathetic, at least at a metaphysical level, right? Yes, I'm still going to go to work, and yes, still going to do this show and make it grow, and I'm still going to do everything I can for my family, but it's not really me determining that, is it? It's the one mind. The one mind is me. I'm not the one mind, but the one mind is me. And if I'm nothing more than an alter in the one mind, geez, then I'm just as good as nothing. And so this has the same ethical problem physicalism does, right? If everything is if the only things that exist are atoms and subatomic particles floating around in space-time, and everything happens this deterministic way, then there's no meaning to life. And if analytic idealism is true, there's no meaning, and there's no meaning you could create, because in the end, it's not you creating anything, and it's the one mind, right? And there's no meaning to any decisions, wins or failures in life. There's no meaning to the choices you make, because it's all the one mind, and there's only one, right? So every love lost, hey, you didn't really lose it in the end. It's all you, and it's everywhere, right? Every family member, that friend that dies, hey, they're still with you because they were just an alter of the one mind, and all there is the one mind. Like it just reduces the world to an A equals B formula, where everything becomes ultimately interchangeable. And I, on ethical grounds alone, I have to reject it. This is not the kind of system that you would want to anchor a society on. Um, and it's really interesting, because this is exactly the kind of system that maybe would have been more coherent within the Soviet Union or even in Maoist China. But even they rejected idealism and took a very strong materialist frame, right? Um, but again, if I was a communist, actually, and I'm not saying Kastrup is a communist, and I'm not invoking communism as a veiled insult. I don't do that. But I am saying that if you wanted to have a communism that is coherent, analytic idealism, or at least, Schopenhauer's thought is the way to go, right? Because if in the end everything is one and we're all one, then if my neighbor's starving, that's the same thing as me starving. Um, you know, so I mean, that's my biggest problem with analytic idealism. My second problem is that, and Kastrup does this intentionally, and he knows he does this because I've heard him say it in videos. Is Kastrup does not use parapsychology, the findings of parapsychology, uh, to shape his worldview, right? And this is actually strategic, right? Because Kastrup's mission is to convince the normies, which is again 96% of the population, right? That materialism is bunk and idealism is better, and I agree with that. Um, and if you're going to sell analytic idealism, you can't use parapsychology, in his view, because people will say when you're debating, oh, well, all you have is parapsychology. Physicalism explains everything except this little bit in parapsychology, right? And so that's you're basing your whole system on this little bit of information. And he doesn't want them to make that false accusation. So he doesn't use parapsychology. He just uses just straight up like vanilla mainstream science, right? And that way they can't, use that, parapsychology club to hit them over the head. But I think this is a mistake. And I'm going to put a link in the description to this interview. And Castro is very frank and blunt. He's very intellectually honest. And when like this whole episode in this show, I'll put the link to, it's about parapsychology, and it's about the phenomenon of people seeing without eyes. Apparently this happens, guys. Some people can see without eyes, right? And specifically in the case of somebody that's, unconscious, getting surgery, right? They're totally knocked out, their eyes are taped, all that good stuff. But they knew what color shoes the surgeon was wearing, and they told the surgeon when they woke up, you know, or somebody, I don't know, gets struck by lightning and they hover over their own body and they see their body in the shape it's in, on the ground, right? And then it's able to relate that to people when they wake up. And again, nobody saw this but that person until they were discovered by others. And so, how is this possible that someone is seeing without eyes? Because Astrup is a naturalist, right? And if you're Schopenhauerian, you would say that open eyes and the functioning of, the electrical impulses going to the brain, especially that back part of the brain, the vision, that's the representation of the visionary experience, right? How is my subjective experience of sight represented on your subjective dashboard of dials, your subjective user interface of the world? Well, it's represented by my eyes being open and let's say some, brain scan showing that, my optic nerve is working and, it's lighting up this part of my brain. That's what looks like in your subjective user interface. Um, but Kastrup is saying that, like, look, if eyes aren't necessary to see, then why did we evolve to have eyes, right? And if that's the case, then he doesn't want to do philosophy because he is a naturalist, and the key to naturalism is that nature is not hiding anything from us, right? You can observe nature as it is and study it and infer from there, but nature itself is not hiding anything. There is no super nature, right? And my answer to that is to say simply we need to have a broader definition of what nature is, perhaps. And So this is the other part that I think of where I think Georgiani is stronger than Kastrup in terms of ontology, is that Georgiani in his epistemology takes in as much data as he can, um, from as many sources as he can. And when it comes to theories of consciousness, I think we make a mistake if we ignore parapsychology, right? Even if it's strategic, right? Even if it's a strategic ignorance, um, used to, steelman our argument in our specific Western culture at this time, or civilization, Western civilization at this time, even if that's the reason, I think if we ignore the findings of parapsychology when studying consciousness, then we're handicapping ourselves. And I think Kastrup does that, though he has a good reason to, right? Um, so where am I metaphysically? Well, I would say that I agree with Kastrup on almost everything, except I reject the Parmenidean one. And it wouldn't surprise me if Jason Reza Jorjani and Bernardo Kastrup are actually the reincarnations of Heraclitus and Parmenides. I'm half joking. I mean, I agree with the distinction between nomenon and phenomenon. I don't want to. I want to be like Nietzsche, and reject that. But I think Hoffman and Friston are showing us that that's the case. I mean, you know, look, you just look at animals, right? Look at the different eyes of an animal, right? Giorgiani has shown me that technology reveals nature to be technological, right? Our eyes are cameras of sorts, right? Um, our nervous system is a data processing system of sorts, right? And so these different animals have different sensory arrays and different data processing systems, and so their subjective experience of the world is going to be radically different, right? So I would say that the world is wills and representations, or should I say the world are wills and representations. So this is similar to Michael Aquino's distinction between the subjective universe and the objective universe. Um, and we human beings have a collective subjective universe that is peculiar to our anatomy, let's say. Um, but the subjective universe of the octopus is going to be very different from the subjective universe of a human being, from an eagle, from a bat, from a gecko. But I reject on ethical grounds that these five are one will. No, they are five wills with five distinct representations of the world. And yet, in some sense, they are all interconnected in some form of Indra's net. Um, and why I say that is because, again, if remote viewing is real, and it is, and if telepathy is real, and it is, then that suggests that everything is connected somehow. In that all the wills are nodes in a network, perhaps, um, or at least at bare minimum connected in some way. So that's where I'm at metaphysically. I believe in the worlds as wills and representations. And I will use Kastrup's arguments to argue for at least half of that. But I have to reject Schopenhauer and Kastrup, their Parmenidean tendency on ethical grounds. Because if we are not, if we're not atomized beings, if we are all one, we are not free. And maybe that's the American part of me talking, that freedom is the most precious thing. It's more precious than life itself. And free will is what you need to have meaning in life and meaning in anything. And an agency for crying out loud. Um, we cannot go quietly into the night. We have to fight and we have to strive to become more powerful as individuals and as a species, in spite of the odds being against us. So this is where my metaphysics is. It's the worlds as wills and representations. That's where I'm at now, and I want to thank Bernardo Kastrup and Jason Reza Jorjani for helping me get there. But hey, make your own metaphysics. Come to your own conclusions. And always remember that consciousness isn't classified, right? Your consciousness is not classified. Explore it, learn to meditate, learn to do remote viewing. Um, if you live in a country where it's legal and safe, like Bernardo Kastrup does, maybe you might want to experiment with psychedelics under a doctor's care. Whatever it is you need to do to explore the subjective universe and understand it, I think that's what you should do. And if you do that, you'll understand the worlds as wills and representations more by doing that than by watching this show. Good night.